gospel reading comes from the gospel according to Matthew and chapter 20. Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual day wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, 'Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first.' When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual day wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received the usual day wage. When they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us? You have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But he replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual day wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give you. Am I not allowed to do that? Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I'm generous? Are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last.'" This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
When I worked in a software company over 10 years ago, when I first started, I was still a rookie in the corporate world, and I used to work so hard to prove myself. Or to be more accurate, I was exploited and overworked, as the corporate big companies will do to you. At some point, I was moved to the quality control department, and there I met this new coworker who was older and more experienced. And I remember one day he told me not to be an idiot and let them exploit me. He gave me an advice. He said, "You need to pace yourself. If you solve 65 test cases a day, the following day they will give you 70. And if you solve those, the following day they will give you 75. And he said, "Don't raise their expectations." So this colleague, Joe I will call him, wasn't really concerned about me, but he was concerned that if I'm doing 70 test cases and he's only doing 60, then his performance will be questioned. Now, in my value system, I do my best. In his, we are paid to work 8 hours, whatever the outcome is, so why work too hard? Now, it was a very unfair company, I have to say that. So, what is fair and what is unfair? what is the ethical thing to do in this situation? To keep working hard, knowing that I'm being overworked and exploited, to work just enough to keep my job, like my friend Joe. There is really no common answer to such questions, I guess. Today we are faced with a gospel story that poses one of those questions whose answer is debatable. Workers started working at different hours of the day. Some of them labored dawn to dusk, others worked 3 hours, yet others 6 hours. The last group worked only for 1 hour. Is it fair for all of them to get the same pay? Now let's be honest, if it wasn't Jesus telling the story, we would have called it all kinds of isms. And I'm sure many of us, if we're honest, agree with the grumbling early workers. But speaking of being honest, if we want to face the reality of our world today, and its microcosm here in the US, we would admit that the events of the parable are no different than our everyday. There are those who labor from dawn to dusk, there are those who join last minute, and there are those in between. However, unlike the Matthean story, not everyone gets an acceptable wage at the end of the day. Moreover, in real life, there are, on the one hand, those who labor and labor and labor for nothing, and there are those who don't need to show up. Those don't even need that pay. So right before we jump to criticize and judge the wisdom of the parable, let us be mindful that it really describes a reality that we live with and we're okay with and we accept as normative. So if our position is that of the late workers, the early workers, it is time to put on the lens of the kingdom as depicted by Jesus and reread the story. Before I dive into the parable, I want to make a redactional comment that will help us frame and define the scope of the story. Many scholars agree that verse 20, the last verse that we read, the last will be first and the first will be last, does not belong to the parable and is a later addition. Now, this isn't unusual of passages like this that whose wisdom contradicts the traditional wisdom and leaves the reader confused about the meaning. So often scribes tend to add a concluding statement to kind of make sense or add sense to the story. So that is not unusual in the New Testament. We also know that verse 20, the last will be first and the first will be last, is a floating saying that was used to appear here and there. So it was a very fitting conclusion for a parable kingdom. Parable of the kingdom. Actually, fun fact, if you go before this parable and look at the last verse, before this parable started in Matthew 19, 30, yes, you will find this very same. The last will be first and the first will be last. So what I'm saying is it is very likely that the original story ended with the saying in verse 19, "Are you envious because I'm generous? Are you envious because I'm generous?" And this concluding statement will provide meaning and scope to the rest of the story. A landowner went out early in the morning to hire workers for her vineyard. She agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and send them into her vineyard. We are told that a denarius was the usual daily wage of a day laborer. Not too generous, not too cheap. So let's fast forward to the end of the story. By the end of the workday, the landowner pays the workers what she owed them and what she had agreed to pay them. If we look at it that way, I do not see any injustice practiced. Now here are the details we skipped. The landowner goes out again multiple times throughout the day and keeps finding new work seekers. She agrees with the late workers to pay them whatever is right. That was the agreement, which in our logic implies a pay that is kind of proportionate to the hours each have worked. However, she ends up giving the late workers a full pay. Whatever is right becomes defined not by fairness or our definition of fairness, but by generosity. Early workers grumble. They complain at the injustice of the landowner, paying late workers more than they deserve. How is that unjust again? The early work seekers forgot that both the call and the reward are in the hands of the landowner. It is she who called them to begin with. She gave them a job. She's the one who gave them that opportunity, and it's her right to call others as well. I'm reminded of the early and late comers to the United States and how those first immigrants wanted to claim their and no one else's right to the land. And yes, I put right between quotes. Those early comers entitled themselves to the land, and like the grumblers in the parable, complained that others may become equal to them. So it's not just for others to become equal to them.
Okay, now.
The parable answers those saying, "Are you envious because there are enough opportunities and gifts for everyone? Is blessing others injustice to you?" Friends, what is initially defined as injustice is actually a striking picture of the divine generosity. God's gifts are given to all, the deserving and the undeserving. And I put it between quotes because really, how do you measure that? Maybe no one deserves any of the gifts we're given anyway. Maybe the early workers, just like the late ones, are all indebted to the landowner for giving them the chance to work, to be productive. Maybe it isn't about hard work, but about each person's worth in God's eyes. Jesus tells the parable hearers that neither time nor efforts are decisive. But what is decisive is that God's grace is beyond human expectations, even to those who are considered unworthy. And then Jesus leaves his hearers to wrestle with why they are finding fault with that, and us included. I think the only injustice that the story names is that divine freedom becomes limited by our human conceptions of what is right. These conceptions that make us all grumblers. If we fail to rejoice in the gifts given to others, we also deny the gifts that we have been given, and we cut ourselves off from the giver. The Israelites in the Exodus story receive free food from heaven without having to work for it, and they still grumble at God's generosity. Like them and like the early workers, we sometimes have an inflated sense of what the universe owes us,
Okay.
or of
Come on.
what God owes us, or others owe us. But we are reminded by today's gospel that at a deeper level, we are all 11th hour workers.
Come on.
And so we all become honored guests of God, not deserving what we get, and yet receiving God's gifts.
Yes.
In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus urges us to pray to be forgiven our debts, just as we forgive our debtors. A reminder that we only owe each other forgiveness and grace. Because that's how God looks at our deficiency in paying back what we owe to God. So I don't know about you, but knowing my nature, knowing what I deserve, I don't want justice. I want mercy.
Wow.
I don't want fairness. I want grace. I don't want proportionate reward. I want generosity. Friends, this is our invitation to discipleship this morning, to replicate that divine generosity, which extends way beyond material gifts. Freely we have received. Freely may we give. I invite you to take the time to type in